My family has so many streaming services. Seriously, you name it, we've got it. Netflix, HBO, Disney Plus, Hulu. I mean, we even have something called Peacock. But despite the extensive amount of paid media at our immediate disposal, no one in my family ever uses it. Instead, if you wander through my house, you'll find my mom playing Candy Crush, my dad watching Twitch streamers speedrun through Mario, and me, with my earbuds in, listening to the podcast Dungeons and Daddies. No, I promise it's not what you're thinking. It's actually a Dungeons and Dragons podcast, which follows 4 dads from our world as they get transported into a realm of high fantasy and magic as they quest to save their sons. And for 2 hours a week, I get to go with them. Now, I couldn't tell you exactly when I started listening to this podcast, but I can tell you that it was right around the same time that everyone else in the world seemed to start listening, watching, and playing this tabletop board game. No longer is it the game that nerds in your AP calculus class play in a basement once a week. Now, it's the billion-dollar industry that has captivated the hearts of Elon Musk and Dame Judi Dench alike. But why? Well, that's what I'm here to try and figure out. So, let's don our pointy wizard hats and travel down to the basement, where we'll first discuss what Dungeons and Dragons actually is and how you play it. Then, we'll examine the frankly insane history of the game. And lastly, we'll look at the recent resurgence of D&D and why it's so important that you know what this game is. So, what exactly is Dungeons and Dragons? Well, aside from being the board game that your dad occasionally brings up from his childhood, it's the tabletop board game rooted in magic, cooperation, and imagination. The crazy thing is, it's based entirely on one of these, a 20-sided die, affectionately known as a D20. And the whole game starts when players first build their characters. First, you start with your race. You know, your humans, your elves, and your gnomes. And on top of that, your class. Your elves, your wizards, and maybe even a fighter. After that, all you have to do is find at least 3 friends who are willing to form your party. The catch is, you have to have at least 3 friends, and one of those friends has to be willing to be the dungeon master, or the DM, the person who acts as a narrator, guide, and antagonist to the rest of the players. From then on, you get to start playing. Everyone gathers their characters, and their histories then influence their thoughts and actions for the rest of the party. And everything in the game is based on the aforementioned D20. Anytime you want to look around a room or find a monster, you roll the die. The closer to 20, the more successful you are. The closer to 1, well, let's just say you really don't want that to happen. And while there is no typical adventure, they all end up looking something a bit like this. You begin here, at the beginning, with the goal to make it here. The end, the thing that changes is here. You know, you start your campaign, nothing seems too out of place, when all of a sudden your party finds a dragon and maybe a vampire and a gelatinous cube or 2. And after about 150 hours, you end up here, somewhere around the end. And while that may sound like a confusing explanation of the game, the rulebook is over 273 pages. So this is just about the most abridged version you will find anywhere. But despite having a rulebook larger than an average book, D&D started as nothing more than a simple set of rules by game designer Jeff Perrin in the early 1970s. It wasn't until fellow designer Gary Gygax added in elements from mythology, Pulp Fiction, and of course, Lord of the Rings, that D&D turned into the game we know it is today. And eventually, the first edition was released in 1974 under the publisher's Tactical Studies rules, to moderate success. But despite an underwhelming launch, the game only grew, launching 5 new editions, switching to the larger publishing company Wizards of the Coast, and amassing over 50 million players as of 2021. However, in the 80s, the game was nearly discontinued. In 1979, 16-year-old James Dallas Egbert III disappeared in the steam tunnels underneath his university, where he and his friends often went to play D&D. His disappearance prompted the hiring of private investigator William Deere, who believed that the game was to blame. And when Egbert committed suicide in 1980, the press took hold of Deere's theory, and soon, satanic panic took hold, and D&D became synonymous with the occult, with the game being accused of using demonology, voodoo, and witchcraft to lure the minds of the youth into sexual perversions and suicide. I mean, the public even went as far as to create an anti-D&D group called Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, or BAD, which, crazily enough, turned out to be a bad idea that led to nothing. Fortunately, the media's perception of the game has changed. If people have any kind of negative view of the role-playing game today, it is much more likely to be about the supposed geekish overtones rather than the eternal damnation of the players. But despite all of the pushback, there has been a major D&D resurgence within the last few years, increasing from 12 to 50 million players within the last 7 years alone, which is in no doubt thanks to the internet and its prominent role in Netflix's hit show Stranger Things. While previous generations had to rely on friends and family members to introduce them to the game, most newcomers are being introduced online. Just last year, over 10 million hours of D&D content was streamed on Twitch, and only 500,000 of those hours were produced by Wizards of the Coast. Some of those other hours were by high-profile celebrity shows like Force Grey or Critical Role. But many of those hours were just regular gamers sharing their experiences. And with the thriving community, the game will only continue to grow. After all, it has always been a safe haven for nerds. Well, male nerds. When you look up D&D Elf, you get hyper-sexualized women with pointy ears and frankly uncomfortably large boobs, which isn't exactly inviting to more feminine players. So why is it that even now, with over half of the D&D community being women, the characters in the game are still so sexualized? Unfortunately, the answer is simple: sex sells. Well, more specifically, sex sold to the primary targets, nerdy teenage boys in the 70s, who thought that this was the closest that they could get to sex for a while. So, unfortunately, the women of the game were stripped of their useful armor, and instead they were given impossibly placed nipples and fur bikinis. And they remained that way for the next 30 years. However, the game has made major strides towards anatomical correctness, with the introduction of Kate Irwin as D&D's senior art director in 2007, along with the release of the 4th edition. She wanted to shift away from the world of scanty armor, stating that the world of D&D is magical, but it's also practical. She feared that the blatant over-sexualization of the characters deterred many women from playing. So, gone were the days of fur bikinis and openly exposed hearts. And now, characters are dressed in, actual armor. And as it turns out, she was right. Following the changes in the art design, the percentage of women in the D&D community is close to 52%, which is a major leap from the 20% in 2012. So, why exactly are so many people playing this nerd game now? Well, mostly because it's never been easier. The release of the 5th edition in 2014 ushered an era of Dungeons & Dragons that is based in storytelling and creativity. No longer is the focus of the game arguing the semantics of fighting a giant rubber duck. Instead, players get to immerse themselves in a world where they can do anything and be anyone. This new edition also placed a heavy emphasis on diversity within the game itself, with characters having all different skin colors, body types, and sexual orientations. As the writers also wanted to ensure that players had the experience to not only explore the world, but also themselves. As the player's handbook suggests, you could play as a character who's a male, but who feels trapped in a female's body. Or you could be a bearded female dwarf who hates being mistaken for a male. Not only does this game give people a safe place to be themselves, that's what it has grown to do. D&D, a game rooted so deeply in sexism that until 2014 had a rule that mandated female characters' strength be less than males, has evolved into a safe haven for nerds, women, and the queer community alike. And D&D shows that when you consider other people, how they're being presented, and where their nipples are being placed, they'll participate. Dungeons & Dragons represent a future where the stories that people watch, hear, and play are as diverse as they are. So grab your dice, and your friend, or friends if you're lucky enough, and let's get ready for that future. Thank you.